So it's finally official. In an interview with the Mars Society, Elon Musk finally pushed up the date for the Starship's first flight to Mars to 2024, and even that seems to be highly uncertain. As a matter of fact, some of the things that Elon had to say were a little concerning to me, and I'm not going to have you watch the whole thing. Feel free to visit the Mars Society. They have the entire interview, but let's have a look at a couple of clips.
Sure that our rate of innovation increases, it does not decrease. This is really essential. In fact, if we do not see something close to an exponential improvement in our rate of innovation, we will not reach Mars. Like a pure linear doesn't get there. Well, I'll be dead anyway before it gets there if it's pure linear.
This statement is a little hard to interpret because it would appear that Elon is pushing the Starship as fast as he possibly can when it comes to development. I can't see a place where he could go exponential any further when it comes to development. So what exactly is he talking about?
You have to achieve full and rapid reusability. I emphasize full and rapid. Reusability is only relevant to the degree it's rapid and complete. And then you also have to do orbital refilling. This is essential as well.
So to me, this is the crux of Elon's exponential innovation. It's the rapid reusability of Starship and the ability to refuel very quickly, which honestly, SpaceX is nowhere close to accomplishing. The Falcon 9 cannot turn around in a few weeks, let alone a few hours. And so in order to accomplish multiple orbital refuelings of the Starship in the space of a few days would require improvement of reusability and repurposing a Starship to a degree that is, well, exponential. And now the model is down to 4 tankers, so essentially on a third of a tank, the Starship is going to make the journey to Mars and have just enough fuel in order to do the suicide dive and the last second pull-up. How realistic is this? I mean, consider this, just to get one tanker to escape Earth's gravity and fuel up the Starship before it heads to Mars with just 100 metric tons of fuel requires 4,500 metric tons worth of fuel between the Super Heavy and the tanker Starship itself, a 45-to-1 ratio. Now, if you're sending 4 tankers, which once again only fills the Starship up with 1/3 of a tank of fuel, this will require 18,000 tons of fuel. By way of comparison, a modern-day guided missile cruiser displaces about 10,000 tons. Does this seem efficient to you, delivering 400 tons with enough fuel to outweigh a modern-day warship? And it's not because the tanker idea is bad or not innovative or anything, it's just because the damn gravity of our planet is so high, as you can see from this Delta V map. Just about any other Delta V from any other destination in the solar system is far lower than trying to get off of Earth. So trying to get fuel off of Earth just requires an insane amount of fuel. But what if you could bypass all of that and deliver the fuel from someplace else? Well, believe it or not, these guys had a plan to do precisely that well before the Starship even began its developmental process. But unsurprisingly, these pieces of along with their political buddies put a stop to it, and it is only just now getting restarted. But still, the plan from ULA has the potential to change everything for the Starship and its future. How? Well, I'm going to explain in just a moment. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, I have returned from Huntsville. I have brought a little friend along that I'm going to talk a bit more about later on. But in any event, I've come back with I think a broadened view of Huntsville, the SLS, all of that, and yet I find myself even more pissed off now about that rocket than I've ever been because I've done some research as of late, and also based on what Elon recently said at the Mars Society, those two things combined have served to piss me off beyond the point to where I've ever been pissed off, I think, since I started this program, and that's saying something. It makes me really want to blow this coffee cup up right now, but I'm going to get to 40,000 subscribers first, damn it. So let's get there as quickly as we can. Somehow it doesn't spoil the coffee. But in any event, as you saw from the introduction, Elon's brief conference call, well, not brief, it almost lasted an hour, for the Mars Society indicated a few things to me that I found to be really troubling. And the one statement that he made is that at the current rate of innovation, we will never get to Mars, at least not in my lifetime. And I tend to agree with him. And he also really stressed the importance of rapid reusability and how absolutely critical that was going to be. And I agree with him there too, because given the current plan, the tanker starships are going to have to rapidly refuel the Starship once it's up in orbit as quickly as they possibly can, turning around one ship after another. It's going to be a very difficult process, and something that so far SpaceX has been unable to carry out. Their Falcon 9s simply cannot turn around that fast, not even close. And are they going to be able to create something that can be reused as rapidly as Elon wants, with dozens and dozens of engines on that Super Heavy and on the Starship itself? Is all of this going to be doable during this, frenetic period of refueling that's in the current plan? And then once all of that's done, is the Starship really going to be able to land the way that it's planned with as little fuel as it's going to have, given that we're only talking about 4 tankers right now instead of 6? I have some serious doubts about that. And frankly, I think that Elon does too. But the thing of it is, there's another way. There is another way that this could be carried out. And a network of refueling, and I think that you're probably guessing what I'm talking about. It's fuel depots, which I've talked about in the past, but I want to talk about it in greater detail now, because a network of fuel depots was planned on by ULA, of all people, a long time ago. They had ships in place for it, all sorts of plans to get a network of refueling depots in low Earth orbit and in CIS lunar space, all ready to go, and only because of the efforts of this damn company, Boeing, and a single damn senator, that these plans get canceled, shut down, and shelved. But there is hope. There are changes taking place, and I'm going to tell you all about them and how they could change everything for the Starship right now. Now, of course, the symbol of ULA, this Delta IV Heavy that's been sitting on the pad since I was in Cape Canaveral weeks and weeks ago, doesn't really inspire you with much of a sense of confidence. Maybe they're going to turn it into a permanent exhibit out there or something like that. But one has to remember that this rocket only had one partial failure in 2004 and has been perfect ever since. So maybe they're just trying really hard to keep their record. But the plan essentially starts with the new Vulcan rocket, essentially a competitor for the Falcon Heavy, and it's the most innovative thing ULA has done yet. It consists of boosters that come from Blue Origin of all people, along with 6 solid rocket boosters to provide 20% greater thrust and increase the payload. It also has a very innovative stage called Aces. Now, granted, this has since been abandoned and they're upgrading it for something else in the upper stage, but nevertheless, the concept remains the same. Aces is an upper stage that is designed to be reused and refueled indefinitely, as you can see, something that the Falcon Heavy actually lacks. Now, this stage uses RL-10 engines from Aerojet Rocketdyne, which utilizes liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, which seems strange because the Blue Origin engines run off of methylox. Why have 2 types of fuel? Seems kind of stupid, right? Well, that's not actually the case. Let's get to the reuse of the engines. We've covered that briefly in the past, but the engines represent the vast majority of the cost, and instead of using some fuel to re-land the entire booster, they instead use an inflatable shield, a parafoil, and helicopters to recover the engines. And they also intend to use multiple launches to do on-orbit refueling for heavy payloads. Does that sound kind of familiar? Well, we don't need to talk about that right now. Now, ULA has many ambitions with this rocket: commercial asteroid mining, commercial habitats, and multiple planets being populated by the human species. Does that sound familiar? SpaceX is not the only company that's interested in colonizing the solar system anymore. Now, if you can ignore that $100 million per launch figure for a second and just consider that the Aces-equipped Vulcan rocket is capable of lifting much larger payloads than anything they've had before, and that's because of the advanced cryogenic evolved stage. Now, this innovative upper stage has up to 4 engines plus lightweight balloon tanks that allows it to carry significantly more propellant than your typical upper stage, increasing the performance by 75%. The engines are also capable of relighting, and as I mentioned before, you can also refuel and reuse this thing. Now, why does that matter to us in SpaceX? Well, because this thing can be used as a tug to transport fuel from the moon. How? Well, let me explain. Aces can be integrated into a sort of tug called the Xeus, which is capable of landing on the lunar surface, pick up in situ generated fuel there, and transport it to lunar orbit, 25 metric tons at a time. That fuel is in turn transferred to a propellant depot which carries 120 metric tons worth of fuel, which is powered by another Aces stage. And by the way, these stages, or rather Aces, is powered by hydrogen and oxygen, which can be found on the lunar surface, at least at the South Pole. It's designed to be a tug that operates between lunar orbit and low Earth orbit. Now, way back in 2014, the Xeus was actually handed over to a company called Maston, and in those days it wasn't going to be using Aces, but rather a less powerful booster, therefore being able to transport less fuel. But once Aces was integrated into their system, it was going to be able to carry a whole lot more, the amount that I've talked about. So, way back in 2014, ULA was thinking about setting up, and as a matter of fact, planning to set up a propellant depot network between CIS lunar space and low Earth orbit. So in case you'd like to visualize all of this, here's a ULA map of their network. The Xeus transfers the moon-mined fuel or any other payload from the moon to Lagrange Point 1, which is essentially a parking lot between the Earth and the moon. It's transferred over to an Aces-powered tug, which would bring the fuel to low Earth orbit. Now, why do you want to do that? Because it takes 10% of the fuel to bring something from the moon to low Earth orbit than it takes to bring something from the Earth to low Earth orbit. 10%. And by the way, as you can see here, this concept has been around for a while. They wanted to use these kind of space tugs before ACES was even a concept. So this could have been in place a long time ago, helping man get to the moon without things like the SLS. So why didn't it happen? Well, the answer is pretty damn obvious. If you can bring the Orion into low Earth orbit and then refuel it using a propellant depot and perhaps a small stage like ACES, then this monster, which doesn't use refueling, is no longer necessary. So this monumental $20 billion+ behemoth would be rendered obsolete by such a system. And so therefore, these greedy low-down pieces of the called their army of political buddies, foremost of which was Senator Shelby, yeah, this guy, who by the way is a real who allegedly said that if he ever heard the words propellant depot again, he would cancel the entire human exploration program at NASA. And so ULA's entire concept was shut down, the Xeus was shelved along with about everything else associated with a propellant depot network. However, there is hope. Tory Bruno, CEO of ULA, recently stated that he intends to set up the propellant network that ULA wanted for so many years. He's pushing forward with it now, regardless of the consequences, because so many of ULA's customers need it, including folks like Dynetics, who during my interview with them stated a clear need for a propellant depot network. But why would this system be advantageous? Why not use the Lunar Starship? Well, first of all, it runs off of hydrogen and oxygen, which is abundant on the moon, at least at the South Pole, whereas methane is almost completely absent, at least as far as we can tell. Plus, this transports 120 tons worth of fuel versus 100, and it has a sun shield and additional insulation to prevent propellant boil-off. Also, this tug could be used to push a larger depot with even more fuel, such as this inflatable one, or in addition to that, it has what's called integrated vehicle fluids that allows it to use its fuel for electrical power and also for maneuvering thrusters. So it only needs the hydrogen and oxygen in order to function. It doesn't require much of anything else, a very long-term reusable solution. So the ACES tug could deliver propellant 120 tons at a time to a much larger fuel depot that could be built and lifted by the Starship, by the way, until it had enough fuel in the depot to completely refuel the Starship, at least in terms of its liquid oxygen needs, which is the vast majority of its fuel. And it could do this for 1,000 tons worth of fuel for the same amount of fuel it would take to deliver 100 tons with a tanker Starship. It's just so much more efficient. And by the way, I keep using this illustration because it was designed by Boeing. Another advantage to this solution is the fact that it doesn't require such rapid reuse of the Starship. Instead, the Starship takes off, completely refuels at the depot, and then goes to Mars. Now, of course, here's the big question. What about the methane that the Starship needs? Well, it could be delivered by tanker Starship in the conventional manner, and it would take a maximum of 3 tankers to do this. The difference would be that the Starship would have 1,200 tons worth of fuel at this point, instead of just 400 to go to Mars, which has lots of different advantages. Now, a long-term solution to the methane problem would be this, and I know I've shown this thing many times, but I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about it. The Queen Bee manufactured by Trans-Astra. Obviously, this is just a concept, but it's designed to be deployed by the Starship. Now, the Queen Bee and its smaller counterparts are designed to capture smaller C-class asteroids, as you can see right here. C-class asteroids are usually loaded with both carbon and water, which are the elements necessary to create the fuel that you need for the Starship. And it creates this fuel by means of solar panels, focusing solar light to heat these asteroids until they produce reactive chemicals, and then through the Saboteur method, you can create methane. It's an involved process, but certainly worth it in the long run, as opposed to having to send up tanker starships frenetically as you're getting ready to leave orbit. Now, asteroid mining is more involved, and there's upfront cost involved here too, so it's entirely possible that the methane may be brought up by tanker starships at the beginning, but in the long run, this is definitely the best solution to fill up propellant depots for the Starship. Even if it has to be done bit by bit, it's still better than having to use thousands of tons of fuel just to get a few hundred tons of methane into low Earth orbit. But why would ULA agree to this? Well, for the only reason that any corporation agrees to things: money. Since the Starship requires 1,200 tons of fuel, or at least that's how much it should have to do its job properly, SpaceX could become ULA's biggest fuel customer, amongst many others, of course. And why would SpaceX do this? Well, it gives Elon Musk the potential to do what he's always wanted to do: get to Mars before he dies, and that is certainly possible with this solution. It doesn't require tanker starships, or at least as many of them. It doesn't require rapid reuse. You could reuse starships a few days from each other rather than a few hours, and also you would have enough fuel to approach Mars and do a powered landing, using the atmosphere to decelerate for a while, and then powered landing for the rest. I mean, think of how much safer it would be if you use the atmosphere to reduce your speed down to subsonic levels and then the engines for the rest of the descent. It would be so much safer and so much easier. A solution that Elon Musk should definitely be interested in, and ULA is already putting this network into place anyway. This is the innovation, in my opinion anyway, and there could be many others besides this, that can get us to Mars in a few years, or perhaps a decade, instead of half a century. During this video, I think probably some of you have been wondering a little bit as to who this little dog is, Laika. Well, her story is actually rather sad. And in some ways, I regard her as being one of the most inappropriate children's toys that I can think of. And I actually told the people at the gift shop that, and they agreed with me. Laika was one of the first animals to go into orbit. The Soviets sent her up, and in the 1950s, and she did not come back down. And she didn't die nicely through euthanasia or something along those lines, as the Soviets claimed. She overheated and died a very slow and agonizing death over the course of several hours. It was a very sad story, and one that a young child who was to get this as a present or something, if they ever looked that up, would probably be pretty traumatized, I would think, by that story. Nevertheless, that having been said, to me, Laika serves as a symbol for human civilization. We are trapped on Earth, and our civilization is slowly overheating, just like Laika. And I'm not talking just about global warming or climate change or whatever. I'm not going to start a debate about that. The fact of the matter is because our civilization is trapped in a limited area of space with limited resources and limited living space, over time, our willingness to share all of this space is simply going to start falling apart. We are not going to be able to survive in the long run as a civilization unless we spread out to the rest of the solar system. It's absolutely vital that we do so. And the fact that we had another plan in place that could have completely refueled the Starship, allowing for a much more efficient use of this reusable vessel and also a much safer use given how it can land without having to use the suicide dive, as I often call it, that we could have had this going and possibly already in place had it not been for the greed of Boeing and the idiocy of Senator Shelby. Had we not had all of these things happen, this all could have been in place and it would have been a total game changer. But there is hope. ULA is back on track and they want to set up this network, and they're going to have to, as my interview with Dynetics indicated. They are definitely in need of fuel depots. And I hope, by the way, that they get chosen as a lunar lander. But even if they don't, if the lunar Starship is going to require this kind of refueling as well, a refueling network. So that all having been said, there is a powerful movement that's overpowering even monsters like Boeing and people like Senator Shelby. Their time is up. And it's time for a new solution. It's time for exponential innovation in order to save the human race, as Elon said. And I couldn't have agreed with him more. I don't always agree with the guy, but I do definitely agree with him on that. So if you want to continue to see programming like this, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, Patreon, my merch, all kinds of different ways. And until we are ready to put aside greed, to put aside the idiocy of the past, and innovate at an exponential rate in order to get the human race to Mars, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.